Hello. I'd like to talk about the difference between trauma and PTSD. Now, some people might say the difference between trauma and PTSD is the extent of how severe the event is, which could be an issue. Some people like to say it's not the severity of the event only, it's how long that event and symptoms impact your life. And I would think that's also part of the issue. For me, with a BCA holistic approach, and you look at emotions as giving power and thoughts as giving direction, trauma becomes a very specific issue and PTSD a very different issue. Trauma happens every day. We deal with trauma constantly in our lives, whether it's little traumas like running late, almost getting in an accident, yelling at someone, relationship changes, weather changes. Little traumas and big traumas happen every day, significantly. So sometimes traumas can be huge, like being able to breathe, and you have asthma. So traumas can be all different kinds of things. And we have skills we bring to the situation to deal with the trauma. So having skills and the trauma, if we can match them up, it doesn't stay, it doesn't linger, we move on. And I will tell you, I had one client who was raped as a 5-year-old, and she dealt with it. And she didn't have therapy, she just dealt with it and overcame it, and it didn't impact her. And it's one of the very few times where I had heard of someone overcoming such a traumatic event in her life. She was fine, didn't bother her. And when I met her as a client, she was, I think, in her 50s. So sometimes horrific things happen. They have the skill set to do it. It doesn't become PTSD. I'll give you a second example. I had a client come in. He had been beat up by the police. And his dad brought him in, and he was in his teens, and he was lower cognitively functioning. And his dad said, "My son has PTSD, and I want you to prove it and treat him with such." And so in the intake, I really assessed the adolescent. He didn't have PTSD. He wasn't stuck. He was traumatized, but he wasn't stuck. And in this case, it's like he was able to bring skills that he had to that situation that helped him digest it, manage it, move on from it. His dad, who watched his son getting beat up, was traumatized. And he was traumatized to the point that he couldn't move on. And he had PTSD symptoms related to what had happened to his son. But he didn't want to really deal with his issues. He wanted to deal with his son's issues, but his son didn't have the same issues. And so PTSD has a different component to it. And here's the difference. When someone has PTSD, they have an emotional response and a thought response, and they get stuck. You can't separate them. If you have a thought about it, you respond. It's just bing, power. It's like a short in your system, or in this case, you can think of it as a glitch that you can't undo and keeps happening. Example is, say someone was sexually abused by a pizza parlor, or physically abused by a pizza parlor, and they associate smelling pizza with the abuse. Every time they smell pizza, they will have that reaction. And so PTSD starts with getting stuck. But then it goes from there and develops symptoms because you're stuck. It's hard to get sleep. And as you get hard to get sleep, you start having other issues related to how you can manage your emotional energy and health. In a future video, we'll talk more about PTSD because there's many different ways you can address and successfully eliminate PTSD from your lives. But I wanted today to just touch on the difference between trauma, which isn't how big an event is, and it isn't how long the symptoms are. Trauma is when you are dealing with something stressful. Anything stressful. Big, small, doesn't matter. Long, short symptoms, doesn't matter. You're dealing with it. The difference is that moves into PTSD when you get stuck. And you cannot not have a reaction when you have that thought. And you can disassociate, you can be overwhelmed, it can freak you out. There are so many different ways. And that you can address. But it's a very different intervention than developing skills to be able to deal with trauma. Hope this makes sense. Looking forward to talking in the future. Thank you.